All right, this continues from part one of lecture 311 for English 491 on contexts of Old English. Last week we had been talking about Romano-Celtic Britain, a Britain that was ruled by a fusion of Roman and Celtic cultures. This was a culture that collapsed basically when the Roman Empire collapsed. Around somewhere, I forget the exact dates, but somewhere around the 300s. The Romano-Celts in northern England, what is now England, were getting simultaneously raided by Saxon raiders. Saxons were a Germanic tribe, and picked Celtic peoples from the north, and they asked Rome for help. Rome was busy being sacked by Vandals and Goths, and they were like, sorry, you're on your own. And that was pretty much the official end of Rome and Britain, although Roman Britain in many ways lived on. Patrick, you may have heard of Patrick. He goes to Ireland, drives the snakes out, converts people. He was a Romano-Briton from what is today Wales. He was kidnapped by slavers, taken up to Ireland, forced to work as a shepherd there, and then he escaped, came back to Wales, and then had a vision from God or something like that, saying he had to go back and convert the Irish. So there you go. So this sort of collapsing world is the world in which, it's a world that's being changed by a huge population pressure and movements of peoples. A movement of peoples that is sometimes called die Volkerwanderung, the Germanic migrations. This took place over the course of a number of years. Last week we talked about the Germanic people, and it's safer to think of these as a language group. The evidence of genetic relationship among various Indo-European subfamilies is pretty dodgy. If we look at Britain itself, if you look at the genetic makeup of modern Britons, for example, and ancient Britons, there's no clear indication that the Anglo-Saxon people took over from the Celts all of a sudden or anything like that. So people are always intermarrying, but there's a lot more cohesion, in fact, to cultural and linguistic groups than there is to genetic groups, so to speak. And so the wandering of the peoples, as it's called by German historians, happened from beginning before 100 CE. But this is the main period in which for reasons of climate, for being pressured by other peoples such as the Huns, various Germanic peoples were pushed out of the north of Europe and into southern Western Europe, and even into North Africa. And these Germanic movements continued for a while. Some might say that the later Viking invasions of the 700s and 800s was just another wave of this. And, you really could actually look at the settling of colonialism from the 17th to the 19th century as the continuing of this Germanic migration into the early modern period. But we had a group called the Lombards who went into Italy, and we had a group called the Franks who went into Roman Gaul, and it became France, and a group of Visigoths went into Iberia, becoming later Spain and Portugal, and various tribes, the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, moved into this part of what had been the Roman Empire, Britain. And so, traditionally we think of it as an invasion, but more recently, it's perhaps more accurate to think of it as migration, as a movement of people. The famous sort of movement of Ostrogoths from over here into Rome. These were people who were displaced by the Huns and who were fleeing war and starvation, and were lined up along the Danube. And the Romans said, "We'll take care of you. We'll let you cross." And when they crossed, they were robbed and murdered by the Romans, and so they formed an army and started marching through Rome. So it's a very complicated story, and it's not just it's not a very clear cut of here are these big Hell's Angel-looking Germanic dudes coming out of nowhere with their axes and wreaking havoc. But they did begin to come into Britain in force around 400 CE, and they came out of Scandinavia. Pictured here this is like Sweden, modern-day Sweden. This is Norway. This is Denmark. And there were these various Germanic sub-tribes, as it were. This is Scandinavia at around the time of Beowulf, and there were Saxons over here. And so they all started wandering for various reasons, migrating into Britain. We have Jutes, Angles, Saxons, Frisians. Now, from what I understand, and I'm far from a deep expert on this period, but the reasons that we have the Angles and Saxons and Jutes and various groups came over as well. The Saxons and the Angles were the larger group of people coming over, larger than the Frisians, and a lot of Saxons stayed behind and they migrated south, and so there's several regions of Germany that are known as Saxony, whereas it seems like, as far as we know, all of the Angles went to Britain, and so this part of Britain, and maybe a little bit more, came to be known as Englalanda, the land of the Angles. And they started out raiding, and they took over the Romano-Britain world, which had been a world of trade and crafts, with farming and raiding. And it was a world that was far more suited to the decentralized, demonetized economy of the post-Roman world. And it was once thought that, the Anglos and the Saxons had basically committed genocide and drove out and uprooted all of the Celts. But this is contradicted by genetic evidence and archaeological evidence. And whereas a lot of Celts did flee both to Cornwall, this area here, Wales here, and perhaps some went up to Scotland, which had been continuously inhabited by Celts. Many stayed behind and became the kind of servile class or the working class for the new Anglo-Saxon overlords, and eventually, usually, they ended up adopting the language of their rulers. And if you read McWhorter, you'll find that perhaps the Brittonic language, the Celtic that was spoken here, affected the Germanic dialects that were spoken in England more than we have perhaps expected. Oh, and some Celtic Britons fled over here to this part of France, which became known, it had been known as Armorica, and it became known because of the large number of Bretons who moved there as Brittany. And so this was Magna Britannia, and this became known as Parva Britannia, or Little Great Britain and Little Britain, or the British Britain and Brittany. So it's a very complicated story, and it's worth knowing more about. But that's about all we need to know for our Old English section of our History of English Language class. Next, we're going to talk about the various dialects of Old English and the kind of evidence that survives of them. See you soon.